Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. Today we're taking a look at my old Kenwood TS-440. You can see I've got the cover off already. And that's because I was taking care of the infamous dots problem that cropped up on this radio. But that's not what this video is about. I've already taken care of the problem. I've scraped out all the material from the VCO section and the dots problem is solved. But what will happen is if the radio's been powered off for any length of time, when I power it back up, the display will actually be scrambled. Now, to get around that, what I do is I do sort of a factory reset on the radio, and then the display straightens out and I'm able to use it. But again, once it sits for a little while, the display goes back to being scrambled and I have to do the factory reset when I turn the radio on. So what I think is causing that problem is a dead memory battery in the radio. So today's video is going to be about replacing that battery. So I've obviously got the covers off, so that step is taken care of. So what I need to do now is separate the front part of the radio from the chassis, because the battery is located somewhere in here behind the display. So what I think I need to do is remove the screws that hold on the front part of the radio to the main chassis. There's two on each side. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove completely the bottom one, and I'm going to leave the top one in place but just loosen it so that this just kind of pivots up. I'm going to see if that gives me enough room to work. If it doesn't, then I'll just have to remove this whole thing and try and work gently on the bench and not stretch out the wires too much. So you can see I've got the radio propped up on a board here, and that's just to keep the chassis up so that I have room to kind of pivot this down. So I'm hoping this is going to give me enough room to access the circuitry that's behind this shield here, which I'm now about to remove. There's 3 screws on this side of the radio, which is the bottom side, and a few on the top that need to come out. Hopefully we can work this out. And hopefully once those screws are out, I'll be able to work this out of the way and we can access the battery that's back there. So I flipped over the radio. It looks like there's only 2 screws on the shield on the top side. And now that I look from this angle, I can see the battery right down here where my finger is, but behind the shield. So I don't think the pivot method's going to work. There isn't enough room for me to pivot this and bring the shield out. I think what I'm going to do is just take these top screws off too, so that I can maneuver the head any way that I need to. Just have to be careful that I don't stretch the wires out too much. Now that those screws are out, I'm able to just get this shield right out of here. Okay, so here is the battery. It's got this orange shroud around it and it's sitting right on top of this chip. There are 2 solder terminals. There's one down here and one here. So I want to take some precautions against static because I think there's a lot of CMOS logic in here which is sensitive to that. Now I do have an ESD mat here, but I really don't have an ESD warning system and I don't have any wrist straps or anything like that. My soldering iron has marginal ESD protection and the humidity here in my shop is on the high side, so I think we're okay. But again, I'm going to go slow, be very careful and mindful of the environment here to try and remove this. So you can also probably see that there is some corrosion on the battery terminal here, so it's definitely time to get this thing out of here and get a new one in its place. So I think what I'll do is put a little bit of flux on here just to help get this old solder to flow. I'm going to use a little bit of solder wick here. So I think there's still a little bit of solder on there, so what I'm going to do is heat this up with the iron and try to work this off at the same time. Now let's try this one. I'm going to be a little more careful on this one because it's closer to the pins in the chip and I want to try not to hit those if possible. So there is a sill pad and some adhesive kind of holding the battery to the chip there, so I'm going to try and gently work that loose with this X-Acto knife. Okay, looks like we got it. So I don't have an exact replacement battery for my Kenwood, but I do have some of these 3-volt batteries in my inventory. You can see that this one has some solder tabs on it. You can see that on this one I've cut the terminals off. These are intended to be mounted in a circuit board or something like that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to solder some wires onto the solder terminal, and then the other end I'll solder into my radio. I will mention that I've checked the voltage on this battery to make sure that it's good, and it is, so I'll get these wires soldered on and we'll try and throw it in the radio. The key here is to not overheat the battery too much, so as you saw I used a little bit of flux and was real quick with the iron. We'll flip it over and do the other side now. So you should be able to see I've got the battery kind of prepped and ready to go in. I've got a piece of Kapton tape that I put over that chip there to kind of protect things from shorting out. I've made a loop on here just so it's hanging on the terminal, and I've made sure that I've got the right terminal of the battery connected to the right pin. If you look closely in there, you guys probably can't see it, but there is a little plus symbol on the silk screen in the circuit board, so I know I've got everything oriented correctly. So what I'll do now is get the positive terminal soldered in, clip this lead, and then work on the negative terminal. So I think we're all set. I'm going to put one more piece of Kapton tape over top of this. So now I guess we'll just start getting everything put back together here, starting with this shield. So before I put the covers back on, let's test this thing out and make sure it's working. I've got it hooked up to my power supply back there, so I'm just going to make sure this is off and then flip on the power supply, and then we'll power up the radio and see what happens. And of course now we're getting the scrambled display still. Kind of expected that, given the fact that I was in there messing around. So what I'm going to do is the reset procedure. We'll turn it on. Hopefully it straightens out. So to reset the radio, I'm just going to push and hold the A equals B button while I turn the power on. That should reset everything and hopefully straighten out the display. And there you go. Looks like the radio is now in its normal state and should be working okay. If I push the buttons, everything is responding. The display looks good. So at this point, I'm not sure the radio is fixed, because this is pretty much how it was behaving before I replaced the battery. In other words, after it sat for a while, I'd power it on with the reset procedure, everything was fine, I'd use it. But then if I powered it off and let it sit overnight, when I'd go to turn it back on, the display would be scrambled and I'd have to start over from scratch. So what we'll do is we'll power the radio off, I'll disconnect it from the power supply, let it sit overnight. We'll try it again in the morning, and hopefully it comes back to the way you see it right now. So let's power up the radio here and see what happens. Okay, so I think everything stayed overnight. As you can see, the display is right where I left it, the mode is right where we left it, so everything should be good to go. I'm going to put the cover back on this radio and put it back in service. That's pretty much going to wrap things up for replacing the memory battery in the old Kenwood TS-440. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. And if you'd like to support my channel in another way, please consider visiting my Amazon store, which you'll find linked in the description below. Thanks for watching.